The champagne glasses clinked like tiny bells throughout the Heritage Club's marble ballroom, and the spring afternoon light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in a golden glow that photographers dream about. Victoria looked absolutely stunning in her custom Vera Wang gown, every detail perfect from her diamond tiara to her silk train that seemed to float behind her like a cloud. The reception was everything you'd expect from Boston's most prominent judicial family, elegant, expensive, and flawlessly orchestrated down to the hand-calligraphed place cards and imported French roses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But as I stood near the dessert table watching my sister pose for what felt like the thousandth photo of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not with the wedding itself, which was proceeding exactly as planned, but with me. Maybe it was the way my mother Margaret kept glancing in my direction with that familiar expression of barely concealed disappointment, or how my father Justice Robert Sullivan had given me exactly 30 seconds of his attention during the receiving line before moving on to more important guests. Maybe it was the fact that I was wearing a simple navy dress from Target while everyone else seemed to have stepped out of the pages of Town and Country magazine. Or maybe it was because 3 months ago, in this very same dress, I had buried my hopes of ever giving my daughter Sophia a sibling. My name is Emma Sullivan, and I'm about to tell you about the day my sister turned my deepest pain into her entertainment, the day my family's true nature was revealed in the most horrific way possible, and the day I discovered that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from. What started as a cruel moment of sibling rivalry would uncover secrets that reached all the way to the highest court in the land, and by the time it was over, nothing about my understanding of justice, family, or my own worth would ever be the same. The thing about being the disappointing daughter in a family of overachievers is that you become invisible in the most uncomfortable way possible. Not invisible enough to escape scrutiny and criticism, but invisible enough that your accomplishments, your struggles, and your pain don't really matter to anyone except yourself. I had spent 34 years perfecting this particular form of existence, floating through family gatherings like a ghost who occasionally gets acknowledged when someone needs to point out everything she's doing wrong with her life. My father, Justice Robert Sullivan, had been appointed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court when I was 12 years old, and from that moment forward, our family's life had been consumed by his career, his reputation, and the social obligations that came with being one of Boston's most respected legal families. Our Beacon Hill mansion became a revolving door of politicians, attorneys, and social climbers, all eager to bask in the reflected glory of my father's judicial robes. My mother Margaret transformed herself into the perfect judicial wife, hosting charity luncheons and serving on the boards of the most prestigious cultural institutions in the city, always impeccably dressed and never missing an opportunity to remind people of her husband's importance. Victoria had taken to this world like she was born for it, which in many ways she was. 5 years younger than me, but infinitely more successful in our parents' eyes, she had graduated from Harvard Law School, clerked for a federal judge, and was now working at one of Boston's most prestigious law firms while planning her marriage to David Chen, a rising star in the district attorney's office. She lived in a stunning Back Bay condo that our parents had helped her buy, drove a BMW that had been an early graduation gift, and seemed to effortlessly navigate the social and professional circles that had always made me feel like an outsider looking in through a window. I, on the other hand, was a 5th-grade teacher at a public elementary school in Cambridge, married to Michael Sullivan, a social worker who specialized in helping homeless veterans. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom townhouse that we rented because we couldn't afford to buy anything in the Boston area, drove a used Honda Civic that had seen better days, and spent our evenings helping our 8-year-old daughter Sophia with her homework rather than attending charity galas or networking events. By every measure that mattered to my family, I was a disappointment, a cautionary tale about what happens when you choose passion over prestige, love over money, and authenticity over appearance. But none of that had prepared me for what happened 3 months before Victoria's wedding, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other but ended with my world falling apart. Michael and I had been trying to have another child for almost 2 years, going through the emotional and financial strain of fertility treatments that our insurance barely covered, and that left us choosing between medical bills and other necessities month after month. When we finally got pregnant, the joy was overwhelming, the sense that maybe everything we had been going through was leading to this moment when our family would be complete. I was 12 weeks along when the cramping started during my lunch break at school. I remember sitting in my classroom, grading spelling tests and feeling the first sharp pain that made me drop my red pen and grip the edge of my desk. I told myself it was normal, that pregnancy came with all kinds of discomforts, that I was probably just being paranoid because this pregnancy meant so much to us. But by the time Michael picked me up to take me to Massachusetts General Hospital, I knew something was terribly wrong. The emergency room doctor was kind but direct, the ultrasound technician gentle but silent, and the finality of the words, "I'm sorry, there's no heartbeat," hit me like a physical blow that knocked the breath out of my lungs. Miscarriage. Such a clinical word for something that felt like the death of every hope I had been carrying along with that tiny life. Michael held my hand through the procedure, through the drive home, through the days that followed when I couldn't bring myself to go back to work and face rooms full of children when I had just lost my own. My family's response to our loss was exactly what I should have expected, but somehow still managed to hurt more than I thought possible. My mother sent flowers with a card that said, "Thinking of you during this difficult time," as if I had lost a distant relative rather than a child. My father called once to ask if I was feeling better, and seemed relieved when I assured him I would be fine, as if my grief was an inconvenience that reflected poorly on the family's stability. Victoria's reaction was the worst of all, a text message that said, "Sorry about the baby thing, let me know if you need anything," followed by radio silence for weeks. The dress had been my one extravagance.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
During the pregnancy, a beautiful maternity dress I had bought online during those blissful weeks when I thought I would need something special to wear to family events as my belly grew. It was soft and flowing, designed to accommodate a growing body while still looking elegant enough for the Sullivan family's social calendar. After the miscarriage, I couldn't bear to look at it, couldn't stand to have it hanging in my closet as a constant reminder of what I had lost. I had packed it away in a box in our basement, along with the tiny onesies and baby books that I wasn't ready to donate but couldn't stand to see every day. So when I walked into the Heritage Club's bridal suite to help Victoria with any last-minute preparations before the ceremony, the last thing I expected to see was my sister wearing that dress over her wedding gown like some kind of twisted costume. She was standing in front of a full-length mirror, posing and rubbing her flat stomach in an exaggerated imitation of a pregnant woman, while her bridesmaids laughed and took photos with their phones. "Oh my God, Victoria," one of them was saying between giggles, "you look so cute pregnant. When are you going to start trying for real?" Victoria caught sight of me in the mirror, and turned around with a smile that was equal parts beautiful and cruel. "Emma, perfect timing. Look what I found in your old room at Mom and Dad's house. I thought it would be hilarious to wear it for some photos. You know, like a preview of coming attractions since David and I want to start a family right away." The room went silent as the bridesmaids realized who I was and began to understand what they had been laughing about. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at my sister wearing the dress I had bought to celebrate a pregnancy that ended in heartbreak, using my loss as a prop for her amusement. The casual cruelty of it was breathtaking, the complete lack of empathy so profound that I couldn't immediately process what I was seeing. "Take it off," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Victoria's smile faltered slightly, but she didn't move. "Oh come on, Emma, don't be so dramatic, it's just a dress. I thought you'd think it was funny, take it off right now." My voice was stronger this time, loud enough that everyone in the room could hear the anger building behind it. "Emma, you're being ridiculous," Victoria said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now, as if she was finally beginning to realize that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. "It's my wedding day, I'm allowed to have a little fun." Fun, she called mocking my miscarriage fun. She called wearing the dress I had bought to celebrate a pregnancy that ended in tragedy fun. She called turning my deepest pain into entertainment for her bridesmaids fun. In that moment, something inside me broke that had been holding together for months, maybe years, maybe my entire life. "That dress," I said, my voice shaking with rage, "is the dress I bought when I was pregnant with the baby I lost. The baby you couldn't even be bothered to call me about. The baby you dismissed as the baby thing in a text message. You found it in my childhood bedroom and thought it would be hilarious to wear it and pretend to be pregnant for photos on your wedding day." The bridesmaids were no longer laughing. In fact, they looked horrified, as if they were finally understanding the magnitude of what they had been participating in. One of them quietly put her phone away, while another took a step back toward the door, as if she wanted to escape the increasingly uncomfortable situation. Victoria's face flushed red, but instead of apologizing or showing any sign of remorse, she doubled down on her cruelty. God, Emma, you're so sensitive about everything. It's been months. Don't you think it's time to move on? Some people just aren't meant to have multiple children. Maybe this is the universe telling you to be grateful for Sophia and stop trying to force something that's obviously not meant to happen. The words hit me like physical blows, each one designed to inflict maximum damage, not meant to have multiple children. Stop trying to force something that's obviously not meant to happen. As if my fertility struggles were a personal failing, as if my miscarriage was evidence that I didn't deserve the family I desperately wanted, as if my grief was an inconvenience that I should simply get over for everyone else's comfort. But what happened next was even worse. Victoria pulled out her phone and started taking selfies, posing with her hands on her stomach while wearing my maternity dress over her wedding gown, making exaggerated faces at the camera as if she were documenting the most hilarious moment of her life. She was creating permanent records of her mockery, digital evidence of her complete lack of humanity, that she would probably share on social media later with some caption about having fun on her wedding day. Stop, I said, reaching for her phone, but she pulled it away and continued taking photos. Oh, this is perfect, she said, examining the images on her screen. I can't wait to show David, he's going to think this is hilarious. Maybe I'll post it on Instagram with something like practice makes perfect or coming soon to a nursery near you. That was when I lunged for the phone, desperate to stop her from creating any more photos, from turning my pain into content for her social media presence. We struggled briefly, both of us reaching for the device, before she jerked it away, so forcefully that she stumbled backward and bumped into one of her bridesmaids, who spilled red wine down the front of Victoria's actual wedding dress. The stain spread across the white silk like blood, and Victoria's scream of rage could probably be heard throughout the entire Heritage Club. Look what you did, you ruined my dress. My wedding dress is ruined because you couldn't take a joke, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was staring at her, this person who shared my DNA, but seemed to lack any capacity for empathy or decency, wearing my maternity dress and blaming me for the consequences of her own cruelty. I was thinking about all the years I had made excuses for her behavior, all the times I had convinced myself that she didn't mean to be hurtful, all the family gatherings where I had bitten my tongue and smiled and pretended that her casual meanness was just Victoria being Victoria. A joke, I said, my voice rising. You think wearing the dress I bought for my dead baby is a joke? You think mocking my miscarriage on your wedding day is funny? You think taking photos to share on social media is entertaining? Victoria stopped screaming about the wine stain and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something cold and calculating that made her beautiful face look momentarily ugly. You know what, Emma? Yes, I do think it's funny. I think it's hilarious that you're so desperate to have another baby that you spent money you don't have on fertility treatments that didn't work. I think it's pathetic that you're so jealous of my life that you can't even be happy for me on my wedding day. And I think it's ridiculous that you're throwing a tantrum over a dress when you should be grateful that someone in this family is actually successful enough to give mom and dad grandchildren they can be proud of. The cruelty was so pure, so concentrated that it took my breath away. Every insecurity I had about my finances, my fertility, my place in the family, delivered with surgical precision by someone who knew exactly where to aim for maximum damage. But it was that last part, about giving our parents grandchildren they could be proud of, that revealed the depth of her contempt, not just for me, but for Sophia, my beautiful, intelligent, creative daughter, who apparently didn't count as a grandchild worth being proud of because she came from me instead of Victoria. I looked around the room at the bridesmaids, who were staring at their phones or the floor or anywhere except at me, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to defend someone they barely knew against the bride whose wedding they were participating in. I looked at Victoria, still wearing my maternity dress, still holding her phone full of photos mocking my miscarriage, still angry about the wine stain as if that were the real tragedy in this situation. And then I left. I walked out of the bridal suite, through the Heritage Club's marble hallways, past the guests who were beginning to gather for the ceremony, past my parents who called my name but didn't follow when I didn't stop, past the photographer who tried to get my attention for family photos that I would never be part of. I got in my Honda Civic and drove home to Cambridge, to Michael and Sophia and the life I had built with love instead of money, with authenticity instead of cruelty. But as I sat in my driveway, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I realized that this wasn't over. Victoria had taken photos. She had digital evidence of her mockery that she could share whenever she wanted, that could resurface at any time, that could follow me for the rest of my life. She had turned my deepest pain into entertainment, and she had the receipts to prove it. What I didn't know yet was that those photos would be the least of my problems. What I didn't know was that my family's capacity for cruelty went far deeper than sibling rivalry and social climbing. What I didn't know was that Victoria's wedding day mockery was just the beginning of a story that would uncover secrets reaching all the way to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Secrets that would make her behavior look like a minor infraction compared to the corruption that had been hiding behind our family's respectable facade for years. Because sometimes when you finally stand up for yourself, when you finally refuse to accept unacceptable treatment, you discover that the people who have been hurting you have been hiding much bigger secrets than you ever imagined. And sometimes the only way to protect yourself and the people you love is to be willing to destroy everything you thought you knew about your own family. When I walked through my front door in Cambridge, Sophia looked up from her art project at the kitchen table with the kind of innocent concern that 8-year-olds have when they sense something is wrong in their world but can't quite identify what it is. Her dark hair was pulled back in pigtails, and she had paint smudges on her cheeks from the watercolor portrait she was working on for her school's spring art show. Michael emerged from the living room where he had been grading papers, took one look at my face, and immediately understood that something terrible had happened. "The wedding's not over for hours," he said gently, setting down his stack of essays and moving toward me. "What happened?" I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. "How do you tell your husband that your sister wore the dress you bought for your lost pregnancy as a costume? How do you describe the level of cruelty required to turn someone's miscarriage into entertainment? How do you explain that the people who should love and protect you are the ones who hurt you most?" Sophia abandoned her painting and came over to wrap her arms around my waist, pressing her face against my stomach in the way she had done since she was tiny whenever she sensed I needed comfort. "Mommy, why are you sad? Did something happen at Aunt Victoria's wedding?" I looked down at my daughter, this perfect little person who had inherited Michael's kindness and my stubborn streak, and realized that I would have to find a way to explain why we wouldn't be seeing my family anymore without destroying her faith in the people who were supposed to love her. At 8 years old, Sophia still believed that families took care of each other, that adults could be trusted to do the right thing, that the world was fundamentally fair and safe. I wasn't ready to shatter those illusions, even though mine had just been obliterated. "Aunt Victoria did something very hurtful," I said carefully, stroking Sophia's hair. "Sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people, and when that happens, we have to decide how to protect ourselves." Michael's expression darkened as he began to understand the implications of my early return and emotional state. "What exactly did she do, Emma?" I told them everything, starting with finding Victoria in the bridal suite wearing my maternity dress, and ending with her declaration that she would give our parents grandchildren they could actually be proud of. With each detail, Michael's face grew angrier, and Sophia's eyes grew wider with the kind of shocked disbelief that children have when they first encounter genuine malice from someone they thought they could trust. "She wore your pregnancy dress?" Sophia asked, her voice small and confused. "The pretty one you showed me in the box downstairs. Why would she do that?" "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, "because how do you explain to a child that some people find entertainment in other people's pain? Some people don't understand how much their actions can hurt others." But Michael understood perfectly, and his anger was a tangible thing filling our small kitchen like heat from an oven. "She took pictures, you said. She was planning to post them on social media." I nodded, feeling the fresh wave of humiliation that came with imagining those photos circulating online, being seen by friends and colleagues and strangers, who would have no context for understanding what they were looking at. Victoria had a substantial Instagram following, mostly other young professionals and social climbers, who followed her perfectly curated life of designer clothes and expensive restaurants and exotic vacations. The idea of my miscarriage becoming content for her aesthetic was nauseating. "We should call the police," Michael said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "What she did is harassment at minimum, taking photos without your consent, using your personal tragedy for entertainment. There have to be laws against that." But even as he said it, we both knew how impossible it would be to prove. Victoria could claim she found the dress somewhere else, that she had no idea of its significance, that she was just having fun with her bridesmaids. She could say I was being overly sensitive, that I had misunderstood her intentions, that my grief was making me irrational. The Sullivan family had been playing these games of plausible deniability for years, always maintaining just enough distance from outright cruelty to claim innocence when confronted. My phone started buzzing with text messages, and I pulled it out to see a string of notifications from numbers I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. Victoria had posted the photos. The mockery was already going viral, spreading beyond her immediate social circle to strangers who were laughing at my pain without even knowing who I was or what those pictures really meant. The first message was from my cousin Rachel in New York. "Emma, please tell me those photos Victoria posted aren't what they look like. Please tell me she didn't actually wear your maternity dress and pose with it on her wedding day." The second was from my college roommate Sarah. "I can't believe what I'm seeing on Instagram. Are you okay? Do you need me to come to Boston?" The third was from someone I didn't recognize at all. "Lol, your sister is savage. Imagine being so jealous of a wedding that you cause drama over a dress." I scrolled through Victoria's Instagram feed with shaking hands, watching my private tragedy become public entertainment in real time. There they were, photo after photo of her wearing my maternity dress over her wedding gown, posing with her hands on her flat stomach, making exaggerated facial expressions that were clearly meant to mock pregnancy. The captions were even worse than I had imagined. "Practice makes perfect. Can't wait to start our family the right way," read one post, with laughing emojis and hashtags like #weddingfun and #sisterlylove. "Some people collect baby clothes before they're even pregnant. Good thing I'm here to put them to good use." Read another, accompanied by a photo of her spinning in the dress, like she was modeling it. But it was the final post that made me drop my phone onto the kitchen counter with a clatter that made Sophia jump. "When your sister leaves her pregnancy cosplay behind and you decide to show her how it's really done. Thanks for the inspo, Emma." The comments were a mixture of cruel laughter from people who thought they were witnessing harmless sibling teasing, and horrified responses from those who understood what was actually happening. But the damage was done. My miscarriage, my grief, my most private pain was now entertainment for hundreds of strangers, preserved forever in digital form, and spreading through social media like wildfire. Michael read the posts over my shoulder, his breathing getting heavier with each caption. "She named you specifically. She tagged you in the posts. She made sure everyone would know exactly who she was mocking." I hadn't even noticed that detail, but he was right. Victoria had tagged my Instagram account in every single post, ensuring that anyone who saw the photos would know exactly who the target of her cruelty was. She had turned my miscarriage into a public spectacle with my name attached, making me a participant in my own humiliation whether I wanted to be or not. "Mommy, what does this mean?" Sophia asked, looking at my phone screen with the confused expression of a child trying to understand adult cruelty. "Why is Aunt Victoria wearing your dress? Why is she being mean about the baby we lost?" The innocent directness of her questions broke something inside me that had been barely holding together. Sophia had been excited about the prospect of a sibling, had helped me pick out tiny clothes, and had talked about all the things she would teach a baby brother or sister. When we lost the pregnancy, she had grieved too, in her own 8-year-old way, asking thoughtful questions about where babies go when they can't be born, and whether we would see our baby again someday. For Victoria to turn that loss into a joke felt like an attack not just on me, but on Sophia's innocence and trust. "I don't know why she's being mean, sweetheart," I said, pulling my daughter close. "Sometimes people do things that don't make sense, things that hurt other people for no good reason." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't entirely true. Victoria's cruelty wasn't random or senseless. It was calculated, designed to inflict maximum damage at a moment when I was already vulnerable. She had found my maternity dress in my childhood bedroom at our parents' house, which meant she had gone looking for it specifically. She had planned this mockery, orchestrated it, and then documented it for public consumption. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment or thoughtless humor. This was deliberate psychological warfare. My phone rang, and I saw my mother's name on the screen. I let it go to voicemail, then watched as she called again immediately. The third time Michael answered it for me, his voice cold and professional in the way it got when he was dealing with difficult clients at work. "Mrs. Sullivan, this is Michael. Emma can't come to the phone right now because she's dealing with the aftermath of your daughter's incredibly cruel behavior at the wedding." I couldn't hear my mother's response, but I could see Michael's jaw tightening as he listened.
After a moment he said, "No ma'am, Emma is not being overdramatic. Your daughter wore the maternity dress Emma bought for the pregnancy she lost, posed for photos mocking that loss, and then posted those photos on social media with Emma's name tagged for the entire world to see. If you think that's acceptable behavior, then you're part of the problem." Another pause, then Michael's voice got even colder. "I don't care if it's Victoria's wedding day. That doesn't give her permission to torture your other daughter for entertainment. Emma doesn't owe anyone an apology for leaving a situation where she was being deliberately humiliated." When he hung up, his face was flushed with anger. "She wants you to call Victoria and apologize for ruining her wedding day. She says you're being selfish for making everything about yourself instead of supporting your sister on the most important day of her life." The victim blaming was so familiar, so predictable, that it almost felt like coming home to a place I never wanted to visit again. In the Sullivan family, the person who called out
Bad behavior was always the problem, never the person engaging in the bad behavior. The victim was always too sensitive, too dramatic, too selfish to understand the bigger picture. It was a game they had been playing for so long that they probably didn't even realize they were doing it anymore. "Of course she does," I said wearily. "Because God forbid Victoria face any consequences for her actions. God forbid anyone in this family actually acknowledge that what she did was wrong." Sophia had been listening to our conversation with the intense focus that children bring to adult drama they don't fully understand, but sense is important. "Daddy, why does Grandma want Mommy to say sorry when Aunt Victoria was the one being mean?" Michael knelt down to Sophia's eye level, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes adults get confused about right and wrong, sweetheart. Sometimes they think that keeping peace is more important than standing up for what's right. But your mom did the right thing by leaving when someone was being cruel to her." But before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a notification that made my blood run cold. Victoria had posted a new photo, this one apparently taken after I left the wedding. It showed her in her wine-stained wedding dress, holding the maternity dress like a prop, with a caption that read, "When your drama queen sister ruins your dress and storms out of your wedding because she can't handle a little sisterly fun." Some people really know how to make everything about them. #wedding drama #family. First #moving on the post already had dozens of comments, most of them from people who had no idea what was really happening but were happy to pile on with their judgment anyway. "Your sister sounds toxic," wrote one stranger. "Good riddance to bad energy on your special day," added another. "Family drama is the worst, but don't let her negativity bring you down," contributed a third. Victoria was not only refusing to acknowledge the cruelty of her original posts, she was doubling down and painting me as the villain in a story where I was clearly the victim. She was using her wedding day sympathy to generate more support for herself while further demonizing me to her hundreds of followers. The narrative she was crafting was simple and effective: the jealous, dramatic sister who couldn't handle her successful siblings' happiness and had to ruin the most important day of her life with selfish behavior. "She's not done," I told Michael, showing him the new post. "She's going to keep going until she's completely destroyed my reputation and made sure everyone sees me as the problem." Michael took my phone and stared at the screen for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, disgust, and something that looked almost like admiration for the sophisticated cruelty Victoria was displaying. "She's not just being mean, Emma. She's being strategic. She's controlling the narrative, making sure her version of events is the only one people see." He was right, and the realization was terrifying. Victoria wasn't just lashing out in the moment, she was conducting a calculated campaign to isolate me from family and friends, to ensure that her version of events became the accepted truth. She was using her larger social media following, her wedding day sympathy, and her skill at emotional manipulation to turn my legitimate grievance into evidence of my instability. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from my father. "Emma, your behavior today was unacceptable. You owe your sister an apology and an explanation for disrupting her wedding. We'll discuss this further when you're ready to be reasonable." Not a single word about Victoria's cruelty, not a mention of the photos or the mockery or the complete lack of empathy she had displayed. Just criticism of me for responding to abuse by removing myself from the situation. The message was clear: in the Sullivan family, Victoria could do no wrong and I could do no right. "They're not going to defend you," Michael said quietly, reading the text over my shoulder. "Your parents, your extended family, they're going to choose Victoria's version of events because it's easier than acknowledging what she really did." I knew he was right, but hearing it out loud still felt like a physical blow. Despite years of evidence to the contrary, some part of me had still hoped that when the cruelty became undeniable, when the behavior became inexcusable, my family would finally see Victoria for who she really was and stand up for me. But that was never going to happen, because admitting Victoria's cruelty would mean admitting their own complicity in creating a family dynamic where such behavior was not only tolerated but rewarded. "What are we going to do?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. Victoria had hundreds of social media followers, connections throughout Boston's legal and social circles, and the full support of our family's reputation and resources. I had Michael, Sophia, and a handful of friends who might believe my version of events if I could find the courage to tell them. Michael was quiet for a moment, thinking through our options with the methodical approach that made him so good at his job. "We document everything," he said finally. "We screenshot every post, save every comment, create a record of exactly what she did and when she did it. And then we find a lawyer." A lawyer? I hadn't even considered legal action, partly because the idea of going to war with my own family felt overwhelming and partly because I wasn't sure what laws Victoria might have broken. "She used your image and your personal tragedy for profit. Her Instagram has sponsored content, so she's monetizing her posts. She targeted you specifically by name, which could constitute harassment. And depending on how she got hold of that dress and found out its significance, there might be privacy violations involved." As he spoke, I could see Michael shifting into the protective mode that had made me fall in love with him 12 years earlier. He was the kind of person who couldn't stand injustice, who would fight harder for the people he loved than he would ever fight for himself. If Victoria wanted a war, she had just picked a fight with someone who would never back down from defending his family. But even as I felt grateful for his support, I also felt terrified of what fighting back might cost us. The Sullivan family had money, connections, and a reputation for destroying anyone who threatened their interests. My father's position on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court gave them access to some of the most powerful people in the state's legal system. If we went to war with them, we would be David facing Goliath, and Goliath had a very good track record in Massachusetts. "Michael," I said carefully, "my father is a Supreme Court justice. Victoria works for one of the most prestigious law firms in Boston. If we sue them, if we try to fight this legally, they have resources we can't compete with." He looked at me with the expression he wore when he was about to say something that would either inspire me or terrify me, possibly both. "Emma, your father being a Supreme Court justice isn't just about their resources, it's about their vulnerabilities. Judges are held to higher ethical standards than regular citizens. If Justice Sullivan's family is engaged in harassment and cyberbullying, if they're using their social and professional connections to intimidate people, that's not just a civil matter. That's a potential ethics violation that could threaten his position on the court." The implications of what he was suggesting were staggering. We wouldn't just be fighting Victoria's cruelty, we would be taking on the entire Sullivan family power structure. We would be risking not just our own comfort and security, but potentially my father's career and everything my family had built their identity around. It would be total war with no possibility of reconciliation or forgiveness. But as I looked at my daughter, still confused and hurt by her aunt's inexplicable meanness, I realized that some fights were worth having regardless of the cost. Sophia was growing up in a world where women's pain was often dismissed, where victims were blamed for their own suffering, where cruelty was excused as long as it came from the right people. If I didn't fight back against Victoria's abuse, what was I teaching my daughter about standing up for herself? What was I telling her about the value of her own dignity and worth? "Okay," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "Let's find a lawyer." But even as I said the words, my phone was buzzing with more notifications, more comments on Victoria's posts, more evidence that the narrative she was crafting was taking hold. By tomorrow, half of Boston's social and legal circles would know some version of this story, and most of them would believe Victoria's version because it was simpler, more palatable, and didn't require them to acknowledge the kind of systematic cruelty that could exist within their own community. The war was just beginning, and I was already losing the battle for public opinion. But for the first time in my life, I was ready to fight back against my family's abuse instead of just accepting it as the price of belonging. And sometimes I was learning. Being willing to lose everything is the first step toward finding out what you're really capable of winning. The weekend passed in a blur of screenshot documentation, frantic research into harassment laws, and attempts to shield Sophia from the worst of the social media fallout while still being honest with her about what was happening. By Monday morning, Victoria's posts had been shared hundreds of times across various platforms, with my name and face now attached to a narrative I had no control over and couldn't effectively counter. I woke up to find that someone had posted my work contact information in the comments of one of Victoria's photos, suggesting that people call my school to complain about my unstable behavior and inability to handle family relationships. The idea that strangers might contact my principal or my students' parents based on Victoria's manipulated version of events made me feel physically sick. This is escalating beyond just family drama. Michael said over breakfast, showing me his own phone where friends and colleagues had started forwarding him screenshots of the posts and asking if I was okay. She's not just humiliating you anymore, she's actively trying to damage your professional reputation. Sophia pushed her cereal around her bowl without eating, listening to our conversation with the worried expression that had become familiar over the past few days. "Mommy, are you going to get in trouble at work because of what Aunt Victoria posted?" "No, sweetheart," I said, hoping I was telling the truth. The people I work with know me, and they know I would never do the things Aunt Victoria is saying I did. But even as I reassured my daughter, I was wondering how long that protection would last. Social media campaigns had a way of taking on lives of their own, especially when they involved moral outrage and family drama. If enough people called my school to complain, if the story spread far enough to reach local news outlets, if Victoria's narrative gained enough traction, my professional reputation could be destroyed regardless of the truth. That morning, I called Rebecca Torres, the therapist I had been seeing since the miscarriage. I needed someone outside the situation to help me process what was happening and figure out how to protect myself and my family from further damage. Rebecca had been working with trauma victims for over 20 years, and she understood better than most people how psychological abuse functioned and how victims could fight back effectively. "What Victoria did isn't just cruel," Rebecca told me during our emergency session. "It's a form of psychological terrorism, designed to isolate you from your support systems and make you doubt your own perceptions of reality. The fact that she's using social media to amplify the damage makes it even more insidious." "So what do I do?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was facing. How do I fight back against someone who has more resources, more connections, and more people willing to believe her version of events? Rebecca leaned forward in her chair, fixing me with the steady gaze that had helped me through the darkest days after my miscarriage. "You tell the truth, Emma. You tell it clearly, consistently, and to the right people. You document everything she's done, you gather evidence of the pattern of abuse, and you find professional allies who understand what you're dealing with. But what if no one believes me? What if she's already poisoned too many people against me? Then you focus on the people who do believe you, and you build from there. Abusers rely on their victims feeling isolated and helpless. The moment you start fighting back effectively, the moment you find allies who will stand with you, their power begins to crumble." As I left Rebecca's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days: hope. Not naive optimism about my family suddenly developing empathy and accountability, but realistic hope about my ability to protect myself and fight back against their abuse. For the first time since Saturday's wedding disaster, I felt like I might actually have agency in this situation instead of just being a passive victim of Victoria's cruelty. That afternoon, I met with James Mitchell, an attorney who specialized in harassment and cyberbullying cases. Michael had found him through his work with veterans who had been targeted for their advocacy, and his reputation for taking on powerful opponents was exactly what we needed. His office in downtown Boston was modest compared to the gleaming corporate law firms where Victoria and her colleagues worked, but there was something reassuring about its lack of pretension. "I've reviewed the social media posts you sent me," James said, spreading printed screenshots across his desk like evidence in a criminal case. "And I have to say, I've rarely seen such calculated cruelty, executed with such precision. Your sister isn't just being mean, she's conducting a sophisticated harassment campaign designed to destroy your reputation and isolate you from your support systems. Is what she's doing illegal?"
I asked, still not entirely sure where the line was between cruel family behavior and criminal conduct. James nodded grimly. Massachusetts has specific laws about cyber harassment and the non-consensual sharing of private information. Your sister obtained your personal property under false pretenses, used your private tragedy for public entertainment, and then targeted you by name in a campaign designed to damage your reputation. That's not just civil harassment, it's potentially criminal conduct. But she's my sister, I said, voicing the objection I knew my family would raise. Don't these laws usually apply to strangers or ex-romantic partners? The law doesn't make exceptions for family relationships. James replied firmly. In fact, when family members engage in this kind of systematic abuse, it's often more damaging because the victims have fewer options for protection. You can't just block your sister on social media and pretend she doesn't exist when she's actively trying to destroy your life. As we talked through the legal options available to us, I began to understand that Victoria's behavior wasn't just personally devastating. It was part of a larger pattern of abuse that had been enabled by our family's dynamics for years. James had seen similar cases before, usually involving family members, who used their social and professional connections to intimidate and isolate relatives, who threatened their control or challenged their narratives. The fact that your father is a Supreme Court justice actually works in our favor, James explained. Judges and their families are held to higher ethical standards than regular citizens. If we can document a pattern of harassment and abuse, if we can show that your family is using their professional connections to intimidate you, that creates serious ethical problems for your father's position on the court. The conversation was giving me hope, but it was also making me realize how completely my life was about to change. If we pursued legal action against Victoria, if we exposed the Sullivan family's patterns of abuse to public scrutiny, there would be no going back to the uncomfortable but familiar dynamic I had lived with for 34 years. I would be choosing truth and justice over family relationships, dignity over belonging, independence over the illusion of love and support. I need to think about this, I told James as our meeting concluded. This isn't just about stopping Victoria's harassment. This is about potentially destroying my relationship with my entire family, and maybe even my father's career. James nodded with the understanding of someone who had helped many clients navigate similar impossible choices. Take the time you need, Emma. But remember that your family has already made their choice about what kind of relationship they want with you. Victoria's behavior and your parents' response to it has shown you exactly where you stand with them. The question now is whether you're going to accept that treatment or fight for something better. As I walked back to my car through Boston's downtown streets, passing the courthouse where my father had built his reputation, and the law firms where people like Victoria built their careers, I thought about the choice James had laid out for me. I could accept being the family scapegoat, the designated victim, whose pain provided entertainment, and whose dignity was expendable. Or I could fight back and risk losing everything I had ever known about my place in the world. But the choice, I was beginning to realize, had already been made for me. Victoria had escalated this conflict beyond anything I could simply endure or ignore. She had made my private tragedy into public entertainment, turned my grief into content for her personal brand, and enlisted hundreds of strangers in her campaign to humiliate me. She had declared war on my reputation, my peace of mind, and my sense of safety in the world. The only question left was whether I was going to fight back or let her win without a struggle. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what my answer was going to be. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive gray clouds that seemed to mirror my emotional state as I prepared for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my adult life. My phone had been buzzing since 6 a.m., with texts from various family members, all variations on the same theme. I needed to fix this situation immediately, apologize to Victoria for my dramatic behavior, and restore peace to the family before any more damage was done to our reputation. The summons came in the form of a formal text from my mother at exactly 9 o'clock, family meeting today at 4 p.m. Your father's study. This situation ends today, Emma. We will not tolerate any more disruption to this family's harmony. The language was precise, clinical, the kind of careful wording that my mother used when she was speaking for the record rather than from the heart. It felt less like an invitation to reconcile, and more like a court order demanding my appearance before a tribunal. Michael insisted on driving me to Beacon Hill, even though I had assured him I could handle the meeting alone. "You're not walking into that house without backup," he said firmly, as we navigated the narrow, cobblestone streets lined with historic brownstones that housed some of Boston's oldest and most powerful families. "These people have been psychologically manipulating you your entire life. You need someone there who isn't invested in maintaining their version of reality." The Sullivan family estate sat prominently on Mount Vernon Street, a 4-story federal-style mansion that had been in our family for 3 generations. The brass nameplate beside the front door gleamed with fresh polish, and the spring flowers in the window boxes were arranged with the kind of mathematical precision that my mother insisted upon for all public-facing aspects of our home. Everything about the property screamed old money, respectability, and the kind of unquestioned authority that came with generations of social and professional success. But as I climbed the familiar front steps, I felt none of the comfort or belonging that should come with returning to your childhood home. Instead, I felt like a defendant approaching sentencing, knowing that the verdict had already been decided, and that my only role would be to accept whatever punishment had been deemed appropriate for my crimes against family loyalty. My mother answered the door wearing her court attire, the navy blue suit and pearl necklace combination that she wore to my father's most important hearings, and to social events where the family's reputation was on display. Her makeup was flawless, her silver hair styled in the elegant chignon that had been her signature look for 20 years, and her expression was the carefully neutral mask she wore when dealing with unpleasant necessities. "Emma," she said, her voice carrying the kind of formal politeness usually reserved for unwelcome visitors. "And Michael, I wasn't expecting you." "Where Emma goes, I go," Michael replied evenly, stepping closer to me in a gesture of solidarity that was both protective and unmistakably territorial. "Especially when she's being summoned to defend herself against accusations that should never have been made in the first place." My mother's lips pressed into the thin line that had always signaled disapproval when I was growing up, but she stepped aside to let us enter the marble foyer that had intimidated me since childhood. The house smelled like lemon polish and fresh flowers, the expensive candles that my mother burned in every room, and the underlying mustiness that came with buildings that had stood for over a century. Oil portraits of distinguished Sullivan ancestors lined the walls, their stern faces seeming to judge everyone who passed beneath their gaze. "Your father is waiting in his study," my mother said, leading us through the formal living room, with its antique furniture and Persian rugs that had cost more than most people's cars. "Victoria and David are already here, along with Uncle William." Uncle William's presence was a surprise that immediately put me on edge. My father's older brother was a senior partner at one of Boston's most prestigious law firms, the kind of legal heavyweight who had argued cases before the Supreme Court and had senators on speed dial. His involvement suggested that this meeting was about more than just family harmony. It was about legal strategy and damage control on a scale I hadn't fully comprehended. The study was my father's sanctuary, a wood-paneled room, lined with law books and legal journals, dominated by the massive mahogany desk, where he had written some of the most influential judicial opinions in Massachusetts history. The walls were covered with photographs of him shaking hands with governors and senators, awards from legal organizations, and framed copies of newspaper headlines, celebrating his most important rulings. It was a shrine to power and authority, designed to intimidate anyone who entered and remind them exactly who they were dealing with. Justice Robert Sullivan sat behind his desk in full judicial regalia, still wearing his black robes from the morning's court session. The symbolism was unmistakable and deliberately chosen. I wasn't being summoned for a family discussion. I was appearing before a judge who had already decided my guilt and was preparing to deliver sentence. Victoria sat in one of the leather chairs, facing the desk, her wedding makeup flawlessly restored, and her designer outfit chosen to project innocence and respectability. David sat beside her, looking uncomfortable but loyal, while Uncle William stood near the window with the predatory stillness of a lawyer preparing for battle. "Sit down, Emma," my father said without looking up from the legal pad where he was making notes. His voice carried the same tone he used in his courtroom, formal and authoritative, leaving no room for disagreement or delay. "We need to address this situation before it goes any further." I took the chair across from Victoria, acutely aware that this positioning made me feel like a defendant facing my accusers, while Michael stood behind me like a court-appointed advocate who had arrived too late to prepare an adequate defense. The power dynamics in the room were carefully orchestrated to ensure that I understood my place in this family hierarchy, and the consequences of challenging it. First, my father continued, finally looking at me with the expression he reserved for particularly disappointing legal arguments. I want to make it clear that your behavior at Victoria's wedding was completely unacceptable. Walking out in the middle of the reception, causing a scene in front of important guests, and then launching this social media campaign against your sister represents a level of selfishness and vindictiveness that I never expected from a member of this family. The immediate reversal of reality was so complete, so audacious, that I felt dizzy trying to process it. According to my father's version of events, I had somehow launched a social media campaign against Victoria, rather than being the target of her harassment. My response to being publicly humiliated had become the real offense, while the humiliation itself had apparently never happened. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking with a combination of anger and disbelief. Victoria wore my maternity dress as a costume and posted photos of herself mocking my miscarriage on Instagram. She tagged me by name and encouraged her followers to laugh at my grief. How is my leaving the situation a worse offense than what she did to provoke it? Victoria shifted in her chair, adopting the wounded expression that had gotten her out of trouble since childhood. "Emma, I had no idea that dress meant anything special to you. I found it in your old room, and thought it would be fun to try on for some wedding photos. If I had known you would react so dramatically, I never would have touched it." The lie was so smooth, so perfectly crafted, that I almost admired the skill required to deliver it with such conviction. Victoria knew exactly what that dress meant, and why I had it. She had been in the room when I showed it to my mother during the early weeks of my pregnancy, had listened to me talk about how excited I was to have something beautiful to wear to family events as my belly grew. But her ability to rewrite history with such confidence was a skill she had been perfecting for years, and one that our family had always rewarded rather than challenged. "That's not true," I said, looking directly at her. "You know exactly what that dress was for. You were there when I bought it, when I talked about how happy I was to be pregnant, when I lost the baby 3 months ago. You deliberately chose the most painful symbol of my loss, and turned it into entertainment for your wedding day." Uncle William stepped forward from his position by the window, his movement calculated to draw attention and establish his authority in the room. "Emma, these accusations you're making are very serious. You're essentially claiming that Victoria deliberately set out to hurt you, using knowledge of your personal tragedy. That's a level of malicious intent that would be difficult to prove, and dangerous to assert without clear evidence." The legal language was deliberate. A warning that I was entering territory where my words could have consequences beyond family.
Discord. Uncle William was reminding me that the Sullivan family had resources I couldn't match, connections I couldn't compete with, and a willingness to use both if I continued to threaten their narrative. "I have the screenshots of her posts," I said, pulling out my phone. "I have the captions where she specifically references me and makes jokes about pregnancy and sisterhood. I have dozens of comments from people who understood exactly what she was doing and were horrified by it." My father held up his hand in the gesture he used to silence attorneys who were making arguments he didn't want to hear. "Emma, social media posts can be misinterpreted, taken out of context, manipulated to support narratives that don't reflect the original intent. Your sister has explained that her posts were innocent wedding fun that you chose to interpret maliciously." Maliciously, the word came out as almost a shout, my careful composure finally cracking under the weight of their coordinated gaslighting. "I interpreted being mocked for my miscarriage maliciously. I should have found it funny that my sister was posing in the dress I bought for my dead baby." The silence that followed my outburst was heavy with disapproval, as if my emotional response to being psychologically tortured was evidence of my instability rather than a natural reaction to unconscionable treatment. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the innocent victim being attacked by her unstable sister, while David put a protective arm around her shoulders. "Emma," my mother said in the tone she had used when I was a child and had disappointed her yet again, "this is exactly the kind of dramatic overreaction that caused this problem in the first place. Victoria made an innocent mistake, and instead of handling it privately like a mature adult, you chose to make a public spectacle that has embarrassed this entire family." An innocent mistake. Michael's voice cut through the room like a blade, startling everyone except me. He had been silent through the first part of this character assassination, documenting everything on his phone while they built their case against me, but Victoria's performance had apparently pushed him past his limits. Taking someone's maternity dress, wearing it as a costume, posting photos with captions specifically designed to mock pregnancy loss, and tagging the victim by name is not an innocent mistake. It's calculated psychological abuse. Uncle William turned his attention to Michael with the kind of cold assessment that successful lawyers used when sizing up opposition. Mr. Sullivan, I understand your desire to support your wife, but you're making accusations that could constitute defamation if they can't be substantiated. I'd advise you to be very careful about the language you use when discussing members of this family. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Uncle William was warning Michael that defending me could have legal consequences, that the Sullivan family's resources could be turned against him personally if he continued to challenge their version of events. It was exactly the kind of intimidation tactic that had kept me silent about their abuse for years, the implicit understanding that fighting back would cost more than I could afford to lose. But Michael had dealt with bullies and abusers in his professional life for over a decade, and he recognized the tactics Uncle William was employing. Mr. Sullivan, are you threatening me with legal action for accurately describing the behavior that's documented in screenshots I can provide to any court that wants to see them? Because if you are, I'd advise you to be very careful about trying to intimidate witnesses to your niece's harassment campaign. The tension in the room escalated dramatically as the two men stared at each other, Uncle William clearly unused to having his authority challenged by someone outside the family's sphere of influence. My father's face had gone red with anger, Victoria was no longer bothering to maintain her innocent victim act, and my mother looked like she was calculating how much damage this confrontation might do to their carefully maintained social standing. That's enough, my father said, his voice carrying the authority that had silenced countless attorneys over the years. Michael, you are a guest in this house and you will show appropriate respect or you will leave. Emma, you have a choice to make right now. You can apologize to your sister for misinterpreting her innocent behavior and for the embarrassment you've caused this family, or you can continue down this path of accusations and hostility that will have consequences you haven't considered. The ultimatum was clear, and the threat implicit in it was unmistakable. Apologize and submit to their version of reality, or face the full weight of the Sullivan family's wrath. It was the same choice they had been offering me my entire life: accept mistreatment in exchange for belonging, or stand up for myself and face isolation and retaliation. But something had changed in me over the past few days, something that had been building through years of gaslighting and manipulation but had finally crystallized when Victoria turned my miscarriage into entertainment. I was tired of being the family scapegoat, exhausted by the constant effort required to maintain relationships with people who saw my pain as acceptable collateral damage for their comfort. I was done prioritizing their version of peace over my own dignity and mental health. No, I said, the word coming out stronger and clearer than I had expected. I will not apologize for being the victim of Victoria's cruelty. I will not pretend that what she did was innocent or acceptable. And I will not continue to participate in a family dynamic that requires me to sacrifice my self-respect to maintain your illusion of harmony. Victoria's facade finally cracked completely, her face twisting into an expression of rage that revealed the person she really was underneath all the careful social conditioning. You selfish bitch, she snarled, abandoning any pretense of being the innocent victim. You can't stand that I'm successful, that I'm happy, that I have everything you've always wanted but were too weak and pathetic to achieve. So you have to try to destroy the most important day of my life, because you can't handle seeing someone else succeed where you've failed. The mask was off now, the real Victoria finally visible to everyone in the room. This was the person who had been hiding behind careful manipulation and social conditioning for years, someone who viewed my struggles as evidence of my inferiority and my pain as entertainment for her amusement. But what was even more revealing was that no one in the room seemed surprised by her transformation. My parents and Uncle William continued to look at me with expectation, as if Victoria's vicious attack was simply another piece of evidence supporting their case against me. There it is, Michael said quietly, still recording everything on his phone. The real Victoria finally shows herself. And not one person in this room is going to call her out for what she just said because Emma is supposed to be the problem. My father stood up from behind his desk, his judicial robes making him look even more imposing in the wood-paneled study. Emma, you have made your choice. If you cannot accept responsibility for your behavior and make amends to your sister, then you are no longer welcome in this family. Your actions have consequences, and those consequences include the loss of your relationship with all of us. The finality of his words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, the complete severing of family ties delivered with the same authority he used to hand down legal judgments. But instead of feeling devastated or panicked, I felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to pretend that these people loved me or had my best interests at heart. I didn't have to make excuses for their behavior or find ways to earn their approval. I was free from the exhausting effort of maintaining relationships with people who saw me as expendable. Good, I said, standing to leave. Because I'm done pretending that this is a family worth belonging to. As Michael and I walked toward the door, Uncle William called out one final warning. Emma, if you pursue any legal action based on these accusations, you should know that this family has resources you can't match and connections you can't compete with. We will defend ourselves vigorously against any frivolous claims. I turned back to look at him, this powerful man who was used to intimidating people into submission, and felt absolutely no fear. Uncle William, those resources and connections you're so proud of, they're about to become liabilities when people find out how you've been using them to cover up psychological abuse and harassment. Good luck explaining to your judicial review board why a Supreme Court justice's family is engaged in cyberbullying campaigns against domestic violence victims. The shock on his face was worth everything I was about to lose. For the first time in our family's history, someone had threatened them with consequences for their behavior, instead of simply accepting it as the price of admission to their world. They had resources and connections, but they also had reputations to protect and professional standards to maintain. And sometimes the very power that makes someone seem untouchable also makes them vulnerable to exposure. As we left the Sullivan mansion and walked back to our car through the genteel streets of Beacon Hill, I felt like I was emerging from a long nightmare into daylight. The family I had spent 34 years trying to please, trying to belong to, trying to earn love from, had finally shown me exactly who they were without any pretense or manipulation. They were people who valued appearance over truth, reputation over justice, and power over humanity. How do you feel? Michael asked as we drove through downtown Boston toward our modest home in Cambridge. Free, I said, and meant it completely. For the first time in my life, I feel completely free. But freedom, I was about to learn, came with its own set of challenges. Within hours of our confrontation, Victoria had posted a new social media update painting herself as the victim of an unstable family member who had become so jealous and vindictive that she was threatening to destroy innocent people with false accusations. The narrative she crafted was masterful in its simplicity: the successful daughter being attacked by the failure, the happy bride being terrorized by the bitter sister, the loving family being torn apart by one person's inability to accept responsibility for her own actions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Victoria's followers rallied to her defense, sharing her posts and adding their own commentary about toxic family members and the importance of cutting negative people out of your life. My name was mentioned specifically in dozens of posts, my photo shared without my consent, my workplace and personal information circulated among strangers who had been convinced that I was a dangerous person who needed to be stopped. But something unexpected began happening as the story spread beyond Victoria's immediate circle. People who actually knew me, who had worked with me, who understood my character and values, began speaking up with their own posts defending me and questioning Victoria's version of events. My principal at the elementary school posted a statement about my professionalism and dedication to helping children. Parents of my students shared stories about my kindness and empathy. Colleagues from the education community began investigating Victoria's claims and finding them inconsistent and implausible. Most importantly, other women began reaching out to me privately with their own stories of family members who had used their grief and trauma as entertainment, who had turned their most vulnerable moments into social media content, who had weaponized their pain against them. I wasn't alone in this experience, and Victoria's behavior wasn't as unique or acceptable as my family wanted me to believe. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the obstetrician who had treated me during my miscarriage, called me personally after seeing the social media posts. Emma, I want you to know that what Victoria did represents a level of cruelty that I've rarely encountered in 20 years of working with women who have experienced pregnancy loss. Using someone's grief as entertainment is not normal sibling behavior, and you were right to remove yourself from that situation. Her words carried the weight of professional expertise and years of experience with families in crisis. This wasn't a matter of different perspectives or misunderstood intentions. It was a clear case of psychological abuse being perpetrated by someone who knew exactly how much damage she was inflicting. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Amanda Parker, the wedding photographer who had been documenting Victoria's reception, reached out to me through a mutual friend with information that would change everything about how this story could be told. "I was there when Victoria found your dress in the bridal suite," Amanda told me during our phone conversation. "She didn't find it accidentally in your old room like she's claiming. One of the bridesmaids brought it specifically for her to wear. They had planned this whole thing in advance, and they were laughing about how upset you would be when you saw the photos." Amanda had been photographing weddings for over a decade, and she had never seen anything like the calculated cruelty Victoria had displayed. But more importantly, she had photographs documenting the entire sequence of events, including images of Victoria and her bridesmaids planning the dress stunt before I ever entered the room. "I almost deleted the photos, because they made me so uncomfortable," Amanda continued. "But something told me to keep them, and now I'm glad I did." What she did wasn't innocent fun or a misunderstanding. It was premeditated psychological warfare, and I have the evidence to prove it. The existence of photographic evidence documenting Victoria's premeditation changed everything about the legal case James Mitchell was building. This wasn't a matter of interpretation or family dynamics anymore. It was documented proof of calculated harassment with clear intent to cause emotional distress. But even more significant than the legal implications was what Amanda's information revealed about my family's willingness to lie under oath to protect Victoria. My father, Uncle William, and my mother had all been present during our confrontation when Victoria claimed the dress incident was innocent and accidental. They had witnessed her lies and not only failed to correct them, but had actively supported them with their own false statements. "Emma," James Mitchell told me after reviewing Amanda's photographs and statement, "your family didn't just enable Victoria's harassment. They participated in a coordinated effort to cover it up and blame you for her actions. That's not just family dysfunction, it's conspiracy to commit harassment and potentially perjury if they repeat these lies under oath." The scope of what we were dealing with was becoming clear. This wasn't just about Victoria's cruelty or my family's dysfunction. This was about a pattern of abuse that went to the very heart of how power functioned in their world, how people with resources and connections protected themselves and each other regardless of the harm they caused to others. And at the center of it all was my father, Justice Robert Sullivan, whose position on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court gave him both the responsibility to uphold the law and the power to influence how it was applied. The ethical implications of his participation in covering up harassment and intimidation were staggering, not just for our family but for the integrity of the entire judicial system. "Are you ready for how big this is going to get?" James asked me as we prepared to file formal complaints with both the police and the Judicial Ethics Board. "Because once we start this process, there's no going back. Your family is going to use every resource they have to destroy you, and it's going to get very ugly very quickly." I thought about Sophia, about the kind of world I wanted her to grow up in, about the lessons I was teaching her through my actions. I thought about all the other women who had been silenced by families like mine, who had accepted abuse because the cost of fighting back seemed too high. I thought about my father's judicial robes and the oath he had taken to uphold justice, and how he was using his position to cover up crimes committed by his own family. "I'm ready," I said, and for the first time in my life, I absolutely meant it. The Massachusetts State Police detective who took my statement was a woman in her 40s named Maria Rodriguez, whose calm professionalism immediately put me at ease, despite the gravity of what I was reporting. Her office in downtown Boston was sparse and functional, with case files stacked neatly on metal shelves, and a whiteboard covered with notes from ongoing investigations. She had worked cyber harassment cases for over a decade, she told me, and had seen every variation of digital abuse that creative minds could devise. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, reviewing the printed screenshots and sworn statements that James Mitchell had prepared, "what your sister did goes far beyond typical family conflict. This is systematic harassment designed to destroy your reputation and emotional well-being, documented in detail across multiple social media platforms. The premeditation aspect that the photographer witnessed makes this particularly serious." Detective Rodriguez explained that Massachusetts had strengthened its cyber harassment laws significantly in recent years, partly in response to high-profile cases where victims had been driven to self-harm by coordinated online attacks.
Victoria's campaign against me hit every element of the statute, targeting a specific individual, using electronic communication to threaten and intimidate, distributing private information without consent, and engaging in a pattern of behavior designed to cause emotional distress. The fact that she used your pregnancy loss as the basis for her harassment makes this especially egregious, Detective Rodriguez continued. Courts take very seriously cases where someone weaponizes another person's medical trauma or reproductive health against them. Your sister chose the most painful possible way to attack you, and she did it publicly with the specific intent of maximizing your humiliation. But what made the case truly unprecedented was the involvement of my father and Uncle William. Detective Rodriguez had been briefed on their positions and their apparent coordination in covering up Victoria's behavior during our family meeting. The idea that a sitting Supreme Court justice might be involved in witness intimidation and obstruction of justice had immediately elevated the case to the attention of federal investigators. Mrs. Sullivan, I need to be clear about something, Detective Rodriguez said, leaning forward in her chair with the expression of someone delivering difficult news. When we investigate harassment cases involving public officials, especially judges, the scope tends to expand rapidly. Once federal investigators start looking into your father's conduct, they're going to examine everything about how he's used his position and influence. This could uncover information that goes far beyond your sister's social media posts. The warning was both reassuring and terrifying. Justice was finally going to be served, but the process would likely expose secrets that my family had been hiding for years. My father hadn't reached the pinnacle of Massachusetts legal circles through merit alone. He had cultivated relationships, exchanged favors, and used his influence in ways that might not withstand federal scrutiny. Victoria's harassment campaign had opened a door that couldn't be closed once investigators walked through it. Over the next few weeks, the investigation expanded in ways that none of us had anticipated. Federal agents interviewed Amanda Parker, whose photographs and testimony provided irrefutable evidence of Victoria's premeditation. They subpoenaed social media records that revealed the coordination between Victoria and her friends in planning the dress incident. Most significantly, they began examining the pattern of intimidation and retaliation that had followed my complaints. The breakthrough came when agents discovered that Uncle William had used his law firm's resources to conduct opposition research on Michael and me in the days following our family confrontation. Private investigators had been hired to dig into our financial records, employment history, and personal relationships, looking for ammunition that could be used to discredit us if we pursued legal action. The firm's billing records showed that this research had been authorized and paid for immediately after I refused to apologize to Victoria. This isn't just witness intimidation, James Mitchell explained during one of our strategy sessions. This is conspiracy to obstruct justice using the resources of a major law firm. Uncle William involved his entire professional organization in a scheme to protect your sister from the consequences of her criminal behavior. But the most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source. Sarah Williams, my best friend since college, had been documenting her own interactions with my family for years, particularly the subtle ways they had undermined our friendship and tried to isolate me from supportive relationships. When federal investigators interviewed her as part of their expanding probe, she revealed a pattern of manipulation and control that went back decades. Emma's family has been systematically destroying her self-confidence and isolating her from support systems since we were in school together. Sarah told investigators in a recorded interview that would later become evidence. They would tell her that her friends didn't really care about her, that she was too sensitive and demanding, that she needed to be grateful for their tolerance of her emotional instability. It was classic psychological abuse, designed to make her dependent on their approval. Sarah's testimony was corroborated by other friends and colleagues who had witnessed my family's behavior over the years. My thesis advisor from graduate school remembered how my mother had called to express concern about my mental health during my final semester, suggesting that the stress of completing my degree was making me unstable. My former supervisor at the community college recalled how my father had made indirect inquiries about my job performance, ostensibly out of concern, but in ways that raised questions about my competence and reliability. The pattern that emerged was devastating in its consistency. For years, my family had been conducting a subtle campaign to undermine my credibility and independence, creating a network of doubt about my mental health and judgment that could be activated whenever I challenged their authority. Victoria's harassment wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a decades-long strategy of psychological control. Dr. Rebecca Torres, my therapist, was interviewed as part of the investigation, and her clinical assessment was particularly damning. Emma has been the victim of systematic psychological abuse, designed to make her question her own perceptions and doubt her right to defend herself, she told investigators. The family dynamic she described is consistent with patterns I see in cases of organized emotional abuse, where multiple family members coordinate to maintain control over a designated victim. The psychiatric evaluation that the federal investigators requested confirmed Dr. Torres's assessment. I was found to be suffering from complex trauma consistent with long-term psychological abuse, but also to be fundamentally stable and credible in my reporting. The evaluation explicitly stated that my responses to my family's treatment were normal reactions to abnormal circumstances, not evidence of underlying mental illness or instability. Meanwhile, Victoria's social media campaign was beginning to backfire in spectacular fashion. Investigative journalists had started examining the timeline of her posts and comparing them to the evidence that was emerging from the federal investigation. When the photos documenting her premeditation were leaked to the press, public opinion shifted dramatically against her and the entire Sullivan family. The Boston Globe ran a front-page story titled "Justice and Injustice: How a Supreme Court Family Covered Up Systematic Abuse." The article detailed not just Victoria's harassment campaign but the pattern of intimidation and retaliation that had followed my complaints. Editorial writers across New England began calling for my father's resignation from the court, arguing that his participation in covering up criminal behavior made him unfit to serve as a judge. But it was the response from the legal community that truly devastated my family's power base. Bar associations began investigating Uncle William's use of firm resources for personal vendettas. Law schools that had honored my father with honorary degrees started distancing themselves from his legacy. The network of professional relationships that had taken decades to build began crumbling as colleagues and allies realized the ethical implications of continued association with the Sullivan family. Victoria's law firm placed her on administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal investigation, effectively ending her legal career before it had truly begun. David Chen, her new husband, filed for annulment within a month of their wedding, citing fraud and misrepresentation about her character and mental health. The perfect life she had constructed through manipulation and cruelty disintegrated as the truth about her behavior became impossible to deny. The criminal charges, when they finally came, were more comprehensive than anyone had expected. Victoria was indicted on multiple counts of cyber harassment, stalking, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Uncle William faced charges related to obstruction of justice and witness intimidation. Most shocking of all, my father was charged with abuse of office and conspiracy to obstruct justice for his role in the cover-up. The ethics investigation into my father's judicial conduct was even more thorough than the criminal case. The Massachusetts Commission on Judicial Conduct examined not just his recent behavior, but his entire career on the bench. They discovered a pattern of using his position to benefit family members and political allies, from steering lucrative court-appointed positions to Uncle William's firm to influencing the outcomes of cases that affected the family's business interests. The final ethics report was devastating in its conclusions. Justice Sullivan has repeatedly used his judicial office for personal and family benefit, undermining the integrity of the court system and violating his oath to serve the public interest, the report stated. His participation in covering up criminal harassment by family members represents a fundamental betrayal of judicial ethics that cannot be tolerated. My father resigned from the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in disgrace, becoming the first justice in the state's history to face criminal charges while in office. The mansion on Beacon Hill was sold to pay legal fees and
restitution. The family name that had once opened doors throughout New England became synonymous with corruption and abuse of power. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came during Victoria's sentencing hearing, when I was finally able to tell my story in full to a packed courtroom. The victim impact statement I had prepared was comprehensive and unflinching, detailing not just the immediate harm of her harassment campaign, but the decades of psychological abuse that had preceded it. "Your Honor," I said, looking directly at Victoria for the first time since our family confrontation, "the defendant didn't just mock my miscarriage on her wedding day, she weaponized my grief as part of a lifelong pattern of emotional terrorism designed to keep me silent and compliant. She used my most vulnerable moment as entertainment for strangers, knowing exactly how much additional trauma she was inflicting." I continued, my voice getting stronger with each word. "But what she didn't understand is that there comes a point where the cost of fighting back becomes less than the cost of staying silent. She gave me the choice between my dignity and my family relationships, and I chose my dignity. I chose my daughter's future over my family's reputation. I chose truth over the comfort of lies. Victoria was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with me or my family. Uncle William received 2 years for his role in the obstruction conspiracy. My father avoided prison time due to his age and lack of prior criminal history, but his career and reputation were destroyed beyond recovery. The civil settlements were equally satisfying. Victoria was ordered to pay substantial damages for the harassment campaign. Uncle William's law firm settled for a significant amount to avoid further investigation into their practices, and my family was required to fund Sophia's college education as part of the restitution agreement. But more important than the financial compensation was the restoration of my reputation and the validation of my experience. The investigation had conclusively proven that I had been the victim of systematic abuse, not the unstable family member my relatives had portrayed me as. Friends and colleagues who had been influenced by my family's whisper campaign reached out to apologize and express their support. Most significantly, other victims of family abuse began contacting me to share their own stories and ask for advice about fighting back against powerful relatives. I started speaking at conferences and workshops about recognizing and responding to psychological abuse within families, particularly when the abusers held positions of authority and influence. The most insidious thing about family abuse, I would tell audiences, is how it masquerades as love and concern. Abusers convince you that their mistreatment is for your own good, that your pain is acceptable collateral damage for family harmony, that speaking up makes you the problem rather than the victim. Dr. Torres helped me understand that my family's abuse had followed a classic pattern of organized psychological warfare. They isolated you from support systems, undermined your credibility, and created a narrative where your normal responses to abnormal treatment were evidence of your instability, she explained. But they made a crucial mistake when they escalated to documented harassment. They gave you evidence that couldn't be explained away or minimized. The healing process was lengthy and complex, involving not just individual therapy but family counseling to help Michael and Sophia process the trauma of watching someone they loved be systematically attacked by her own relatives. Sophia, in particular, struggled to understand how adults could be so deliberately cruel, especially adults who were supposed to love and protect their family members. Sometimes people who have power use it to hurt others instead of helping them. I explained to her during one of our many conversations about what had happened. And sometimes the only way to stop them is to be brave enough to tell the truth, even when it's scary and difficult. Sophia's response was typically direct and insightful for a 9-year-old. So Aunt Victoria and Grandpa and everyone were bullies, and you had to tell the teacher on them. That's exactly right, sweetheart. Sometimes adults need to tell the teacher too. 2 years after Victoria's wedding day harassment, my life looked completely different. Michael had been promoted to director of his Veterans Services organization, partly due to the leadership skills he had demonstrated during our legal battle. Sophia was thriving in an advanced arts program, her creativity flourishing in an environment free from the subtle toxicity that had always surrounded family gatherings. I had left my position at the community college to work full-time with a nonprofit organization that helped family abuse victims navigate the legal system and rebuild their lives after escaping toxic relationships. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding, allowing me to use my experience to help others who were facing similar battles against powerful abusers. Our new home was modest but comfortable, purchased with funds from the civil settlements and designed around our actual needs rather than anyone else's expectations. Sophia had the art studio she had always dreamed of, Michael had space for his woodworking projects, and I had an office where I could work on advocacy and writing without interruption. The miscarriage that Victoria had mocked so cruelly remained a source of grief, but it was no longer weaponized against me by people who claimed to love me. Michael and I had decided to focus on the family we had rather than continuing to pursue additional children, and Sophia's joy and creativity filled our home with the kind of authentic happiness that no amount of money or social status could provide. On the second anniversary of Victoria's wedding, a package arrived at our house with no return address. Inside was a simple card with a handwritten note. Emma, I wanted you to know that watching you fight back against your family's abuse gave me the courage to leave my own abusive situation. Your story saved my life. Thank you for showing me that dignity is worth fighting for. The card was unsigned, but it represented dozens of similar messages I had received from women who had found the strength to escape their own toxic families after seeing that it was possible to survive and thrive after choosing truth over false peace. Victoria's cruelty had inadvertently created a catalyst for justice that extended far beyond our immediate situation. As I stood in Sophia's art studio that evening, watching her work on a painting for her school's spring exhibition, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. 2 years ago, I had been trapped in a family dynamic that required me to accept mistreatment as the price of belonging. Today, I was free to build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Victoria had intended to destroy me with her wedding day humiliation, to reduce me to the broken, submissive family member I had always been expected to be. Instead, she had given me the evidence I needed to expose the systematic abuse that had controlled my life for decades and the courage to fight for something better. "Mommy, come look at this." Sophia called from her easel, where she was putting the finishing touches on a portrait of our family. In her painting, the three of us stood in front of our new house, surrounded by vibrant flowers and bathed in golden sunlight. There were no shadows, no hidden darkness, no suggestion of the trauma we had survived to reach this moment of peace. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, wrapping my arms around my daughter as she beamed with pride at her creation. "It's absolutely perfect," and for the first time in my adult life, I meant those words completely. Our life wasn't perfect by conventional standards. We weren't wealthy or socially prominent. We didn't live in prestigious neighborhoods or attend exclusive events. But it was built on truth, love, and the hard-won understanding that some relationships are worth fighting for and others are worth walking away from. The Supreme Court Justice's daughter had finally learned to recognize justice when she saw it, and more importantly, she had learned that sometimes you have to be willing to demand it for yourself. Victoria's wedding dress mockery had been intended as the final blow in a lifetime of psychological warfare. Instead, it had become the first day of my freedom. Justice, I had discovered, sometimes comes dressed in the most unexpected ways. And sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you exactly what you need to save yourself. 5 years have passed since that devastating wedding day, and as I sit in my office at the Massachusetts Family Justice Center, surrounded by case files and thank you letters from clients who have successfully escaped abusive family situations, I can hardly recognize the woman I used to be. The timid, apologetic person who once accepted cruelty as the price of belonging has been replaced by someone who understands that true strength comes not from enduring abuse, but from refusing to accept it. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Recovery from decades of psychological manipulation required extensive therapy, legal battles that lasted 2 years, and the kind of soul-deep examination of family dynamics that most people never have to undertake. But each step of the journey revealed new layers of freedom I hadn't even known I was missing, like discovering rooms in your own house that you never knew existed. Dr. Rebecca Torres, who became not just my therapist but a trusted advisor and eventually a close friend, helped me understand that my family's abuse had been sophisticated in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. "Emma, what you survived wasn't just casual meanness or typical family dysfunction," she explained during one of our sessions 2 years into my recovery. "It was an organized system of psychological control, designed to keep you in a subordinate position while extracting maximum benefit from your compliance and suffering." The legal aftermath of Victoria's harassment campaign had exposed the full scope of this system. Federal investigators had uncovered financial records showing that my parents had been systematically draining money from a trust fund that my grandmother had established for my education and future security. While I was struggling to pay bills and put off necessary medical care, they had been using my inheritance to fund luxury vacations, home renovations, and Victoria's law school tuition. The discovery of this financial abuse had expanded the criminal charges against my family and resulted in additional federal prison time for my father. Justice Robert Sullivan, who had once been considered for appointment to the United States Supreme Court, ended up serving 4 years in federal prison for embezzlement, abuse of office, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The irony wasn't lost on legal commentators that a man who had built his career on upholding the law had spent decades systematically breaking it for personal gain. Uncle William's law firm had ultimately dissolved under the weight of the scandal, with several partners facing disciplinary action for their roles in the intimidation campaign against me. The ripple effects extended throughout Boston's legal community, prompting reviews of ethical practices at other prestigious firms, and resulting in new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the abuse of professional resources for personal vendettas. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the legal resolution was Victoria's complete fall from grace. Her 18-month federal prison sentence had been followed by years of unsuccessful attempts to rebuild her reputation and career. No law firm would hire her, her social media following had evaporated, and her marriage to David Chen had been annulled so quickly that most people forgot it had ever happened. The last I heard, Victoria was working as a paralegal at a small personal injury firm in western Massachusetts, living in a studio apartment and driving a used car that was older than the Honda Civic she had once mocked me for owning. The entitled princess who had thought my pain was her entertainment had learned what it felt like to have her own life destroyed by consequences she never thought would reach her. My mother, Margaret Sullivan, had avoided criminal charges but faced her own form of justice through complete social exile. The charity boards and cultural institutions that had once competed for her involvement wanted nothing to do with a woman whose family had become synonymous with corruption and abuse. She had sold the Beacon Hill mansion and moved to a small condo in Florida, where she lived in relative obscurity and declining health. The few times she had attempted to contact me over the years, her messages had been filled with the same manipulative language that had controlled me for decades. "Emma, I hope you're satisfied with what you've done to this family," read one particularly memorable email. "Your father's health is failing, Victoria can barely find work, and I'm living like a pauper because of your vindictive need for revenge. I hope the money you received was worth destroying the people who raised you and loved you." The message had been so perfectly emblematic of her psychological manipulation that I had shared it with Dr. Torres as an example of how abusers attempt to maintain control even after their victims have escaped. "Notice how she makes herself and your father the victims of your decision to seek justice," Dr. Torres pointed out. "She's still trying to convince you that defending yourself was an act of cruelty rather than an act of survival." I had blocked my mother's email address after that message and felt nothing but relief at the silence that followed. The woman who had raised me had never actually loved me. She had loved the idea of me as a compliant victim who would absorb abuse without fighting back and provide a useful contrast to Victoria's supposed perfection. Once I refused to play that role, I became expendable to her, which told me everything I needed to know about the authenticity of her maternal feelings. The financial settlements from the various civil suits had provided security that I had never imagined possible. The embezzled trust fund money was returned with interest, the harassment settlements covered years of therapy and legal expenses, and the punitive damages had been substantial enough to fund Sophia's college education and allow me to pursue meaningful work without worrying about financial survival. But more valuable than the money was the validation that came with having my version of events officially recognized as truth. For decades, my family had gaslighted me into questioning my own perceptions, making me doubt whether their treatment was really as bad as it seemed, or whether I was just too sensitive to handle normal family dynamics. The federal investigation had conclusively proven that their behavior constituted criminal abuse, not typical family conflict. The validation had been crucial for my relationship with Sophia, who had witnessed enough of the family dynamics to be confused about what was normal and what was harmful. "Mommy, why did Grandpa and Aunt Victoria lie so much about what they did to you?" she had asked during one of our many conversations about the legal proceedings. "Some people would rather lie than admit they were wrong," I had explained. "They thought that if they could convince everyone that I was the problem, they wouldn't have to face consequences for hurting me. But lying doesn't change the truth, and eventually the truth always comes out." Sophia's artistic talents had flourished in an environment free from the subtle toxicity that had always surrounded family gatherings. Her paintings and drawings often depicted themes of truth conquering lies, victims becoming heroes, and families built on love rather than fear and obligation. Her school counselor had remarked that Sophia seemed unusually mature and insightful about justice and fairness, qualities that would serve her well as she navigated her own relationships throughout life. Michael had emerged from the ordeal as something of a hero in his professional community. His unwavering support for me during the family confrontations and legal battles had impressed colleagues and supervisors, who promoted him to Regional Director of Veterans Services. His willingness to stand up to powerful people who were threatening his wife had earned him respect and admiration that translated into career opportunities and meaningful friendships.
I married you because I loved who you were, he told me during one of our anniversary dinners. But watching you fight for yourself and our family showed me strengths in you that I didn't even know existed. You're not the same person you were 5 years ago, and I love who you've become even more. The woman I had become was someone who understood her own worth and refused to compromise it for other people's comfort. I had learned to recognize manipulation and gaslighting before they could take root, to set boundaries that couldn't be crossed without consequences, and to prioritize my mental health and family's well-being over the opinions of people who didn't genuinely care about us. My work at the Massachusetts Family Justice Center had become a calling rather than just a career. I specialized in cases involving family members who used their professional positions or social connections to intimidate and control relatives, particularly situations where victims were afraid to report abuse because of their abusers' reputations or resources. The hardest part about escaping family abuse, I would tell clients, isn't the practical challenges of cutting contact or rebuilding your life. It's overcoming the psychological programming that tells you family relationships are worth preserving at any cost, even when that cost is your sanity, safety, and self-respect. My story had become a case study in several law schools and psychology programs, used to illustrate how systematic family abuse operates and how victims can effectively fight back against powerful abusers. I had testified before legislative committees about the need for stronger protections against cyber harassment and family intimidation, helping to draft laws that made it easier for victims to obtain restraining orders against relatives who use social media to terrorize them. The speaking engagements and consulting work that grew out of my advocacy had connected me with survivors across the country who were dealing with similar situations. I had helped adult children escape financial abuse by parents who controlled their inheritance or trust funds, siblings who were being harassed by relatives with professional connections, and spouses who were being intimidated by in-laws with political or judicial influence. Each success story reinforced the lesson I had learned from my own experience. Abusers count on their victims believing that fighting back is hopeless, that their resources and connections make them untouchable, that family loyalty requires accepting mistreatment without resistance. But most abusers, no matter how powerful they seem, have vulnerabilities that become exposed when their behavior is brought into the light of public scrutiny. The annual gala for the Massachusetts Family Justice Center had become one of the most well-attended charity events in Boston, partly because of the high-profile nature of the Sullivan family case and the media attention it had generated. At this year's gala, I was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award for my advocacy work, standing at a podium in the same city where my family had once held social and professional power. 5 years ago, I was a woman who had been psychologically programmed to believe that my pain didn't matter, that my dignity was expendable, and that family relationships were worth preserving regardless of how much they cost me, I said in my acceptance speech. Today I understand that some relationships are worth fighting for, and others are worth walking away from, and that the difference between the two is whether they're built on love or control. The audience included several judges, attorneys, and political figures who had once been part of my father's professional circle. Some of them had supported my family during the early stages of the scandal, believing their version of events over mine. Others had remained neutral, waiting to see which way the wind would blow before choosing sides. A few had quietly supported me from the beginning, offering professional references and character testimony when I needed them most. But what mattered most to me were the survivors in the audience, women and men who had found the courage to escape their own abusive family situations after hearing my story. They represented the true measure of success, not the legal victories or financial settlements, but the lives that had been saved and the cycles of abuse that had been broken. After the gala, as Michael, Sophia, and I drove home through the streets of Cambridge to our comfortable house with its well-tended garden and Sophia's art studio, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The woman who had once accepted humiliation as the price of family belonging had become someone who understood that true belonging comes from relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care. "Mommy, are you happy?" Sophia asked from the back seat, the question arising from the 9-year-old's intuitive understanding that adults sometimes carried sadness even during moments of celebration. "I'm completely happy, sweetheart," I replied, and realized that I meant it without reservation. "I'm happy because we're safe, because we love each other, and because we never have to pretend to be someone we're not to earn that love." The house that welcomed us that night was filled with authentic joy rather than the performative happiness that had characterized my childhood home. Sophia's artwork covered the refrigerator and lined the hallways. Michael's woodworking projects occupied the garage workspace he had always dreamed of having, and my office contained files representing dozens of families who had found freedom from abuse with help from our organization. As I tucked Sophia into bed and listened to her chatter about her plans for the weekend art workshop she was attending, I marveled at the confidence and security she possessed at 9 years old. She had never known what it felt like to walk on eggshells around family members, to have her emotions dismissed as dramatic overreactions, or to accept cruelty as the price of belonging. She was growing up understanding that she deserved to be treated with kindness and respect, and that no relationship was worth maintaining if it required her to sacrifice her dignity. "Mommy, do you think Aunt Victoria ever thinks about what she did to you?" Sophia asked as I turned off her bedroom light. The question caught me off guard, partly because Sophia rarely mentioned my sister anymore, and partly because I realized I didn't know the answer. "I don't know, sweetheart. Some people learn from their mistakes and try to become better, and other people just get angry about facing consequences. I hope she learned something, but what matters most is that we learn to protect ourselves." "I'm glad you fought back," Sophia said sleepily. "Even though it was scary and hard, I'm glad you didn't let them keep being mean to us." As I walked back to the living room where Michael was reading, I thought about Sophia's words and the lessons they represented. My daughter would grow up knowing that victims could become victors, that justice was worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible, and that sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up giving you exactly what you need to save yourself. The maternity dress that Victoria had used to mock my miscarriage had been entered into evidence during her trial and was now stored somewhere in a federal courthouse basement. But the pregnancy loss it represented was no longer a source of shame or secret grief. It had become part of a larger story about survival, resistance, and the power of refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. Michael and I had decided not to have more children, choosing instead to focus our energy on raising Sophia and helping other families heal from trauma. Our decision felt right and complete, motivated by love rather than fear, based on our genuine preferences rather than financial constraints or family pressure. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just apologized to Victoria that day? Michael asked as we settled onto the couch together, referring to the family meeting where I had finally refused to accept blame for being abused. I considered the question seriously, imagining the alternative timeline where I had chosen false peace over authentic dignity. I think I would have spent the rest of my life getting smaller and smaller until there was nothing left of me. I said, and Sophia would have grown up watching her mother disappear piece by piece, learning that women should accept mistreatment to keep other people comfortable. "She's never going to learn that lesson," Michael said firmly. "Because she's going to grow up knowing that her mother was brave enough to fight for what was right, even when it cost everything she thought she wanted." As we sat together in our living room, surrounded by evidence of the life we had built through love, rather than manipulation, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you have lived authentically. The Supreme Court Justice's daughter had finally learned what justice really looked like, and it had nothing to do with prestigious positions or social status. It had everything to do with treating people with dignity, holding abusers accountable for their actions, and understanding that some fights are worth having regardless of the cost. Victoria's wedding dress mockery had been intended as the final blow in a lifetime of psychological warfare. Instead, it had become the catalyst for my liberation and the beginning of a new life, built on truth, love, and the hard-won understanding that dignity is never negotiable. The ripple effects of my decision to fight back had extended far beyond my immediate family. Legislative changes, legal precedents, professional standards, and individual lives had all been touched by the consequences of refusing to accept abuse from people who thought their power made them untouchable. Justice, I had learned, sometimes arrives in the most unexpected packages and transforms not just individual lives, but entire systems that had protected abusers for too long. 5 years later, I could honestly say that Victoria had given me the greatest gift she ever could have given me. She had shown me exactly who she really was, and forced me to decide who I wanted to be. I had chosen dignity over false peace, truth over comfortable lies, and authentic relationships over toxic family bonds. And in making that choice, I had discovered strengths I never knew I possessed, and built a life more beautiful than anything I could have imagined while I was still trapped in their web of control and manipulation. The girl who had once been afraid to embarrass her family had become a woman who understood that some families aren't worth protecting, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable their cruelty any longer. And that understanding had set not just me free, but had opened doors to freedom for countless others who had been waiting for someone to show them that escape was possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.